Well, welcome everybody to today's final session. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Stephen Darwall, who's going to be speaking to us in this session. Chairs are under strict instructions not to introduce the speakers any more than I just have done, and not to give you a little potted biography. And in this particular case, that's perhaps as well, because we might be here for half the session if I listed all of Stephen's accomplishments and all of his great work. So I will limit it to that and hand over to Stephen, who's going to be talking about Williams, Kant, and morality's peculiarity.
Thank you, Adrian. Can people hear me? Okay, good, great. Well, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here, and thanks very much to Paul and everybody here, and of course to the Swedish Research Council, and of course to Bernard Williams, who inspired all of us. There's so many things I could share, memories, not that I knew Bernard very closely, but I remember one time he was in my office when he came to the University of Michigan. I've told Patricia this already, so you didn't say, don't say this, so right. And this was such a quintessential Williams remark. We were talking about the Michigan philosophy department. He said, oh, well, we always thought of Michigan as the General Motors of philosophy. So I thought, you know, okay, yeah. Point taken. Let's talk about something else. Right. Okay. So chapter 10 of Bernard Williams' Ethics and the Limits of Philosophy, Morality, the Peculiar Institution, is something of an abolitionist tract. Our peculiar institution, of course, was the phrase frequently used in the antebellum South to refer to chattel slavery. And Williams's argument in that chapter is that morality, or as he calls it, the morality system, is like slavery, something, quote, we would be better off without. Now, I have to say, in thinking about this recently, I've been struck by, you know, there's been a lot more scholarship coming out in the last 35 years, both about slavery and about abolition movements and so on. And it just seems to me unlikely that either abolitionism in England, with the Quakers and all told in a wonderful book called Bury These Chains by Adam Hawkshield, which I very much recommend to you, on the one hand, or abolitionism in the United States would have gone very far without the morality system. And there's this very strong sense of a moral obligation to destroy slavery on the part of abolitionists. I just note that. Williams' abolitionist argument shows a deep grasp of morality's conceptual contours, much deeper, it should be said, than that of many of morality's proponents. There are four main Williamsian insights that you have there, number one on your sheet. First, Williams appreciates that a central, perhaps the central feature of morality is the role played by the concept of moral obligation. Morality is distinguished, he says, by the special notion of obligation it uses. In this, Williams follows Elizabeth Anscombe's early abolitionist essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, which took aim at morality's law conception of ethics. Second, Williams sees the conceptual connection between moral obligation and accountability, specifically that violations of moral obligation are conceptually connected to accountability-seeking attitudes like blame and accountability constituting practices that express those attitudes. Blame, Williams says, is the characteristic reaction of the morality system. Third, Williams appreciates that an important feature of moral obligation is its putative, deliberative priority, that moral obligations purport to give those subject to them conclusive reasons for complying with them. And fourth, he sees that this authoritative aspiration of moral obligation goes via the nature of blame as a holding accountable attitude. Blame can be justified only on the assumption that its object lacked sufficient reason for doing whatever they're blamed for doing. As we'll see, Williams thinks this presupposition is a fiction, though one that can, to some extent, be made good proleptically. And we heard about that in Miranda's talk leading off the conference. In my view, Williams is deeply right about all four of these aspects, though not that blame's presupposition need be fictional. I've defended each of these four Williamsian claims about morality, indeed, in my own work on the second personal character of deontic moral notions over the last 15 or so years. Each Williamsian claim illustrates, as I see it, a way in which moral obligation, and therefore the morality system, is irreducibly second personal, as I'll try to show presently. Blame is a Strawsonian reactive attitude through which we hold others and ourselves accountable, second personally, for complying with moral obligations which are in their nature what it would be blameworthy to fail to comply with without excuse. However, Williams also holds that, as he puts it, if obligation is allowed to structure ethical thought, there are several natural ways in which it can come to dominate life altogether. Moral obligation comes to bind us so ubiquitously and thoroughly that the moral life becomes perpetual bondage. Unsurprisingly, I think Williams is wrong about that. I'll be arguing in what follows, in fact, that focusing on the deontic aspects of morality that he himself emphasizes can help us to see why he is. Briefly, though Williams himself sees and notes a distinction between what moral reasons most recommend on the one hand and moral obligation on the other, his abolitionist arguments depend on occluding this distinction. Williams thinks that there are conceptual pressures within the morality system that encourage thinking that all morally relevant considerations, or even all ethically relevant considerations more broadly, entail moral obligations. More on Williams's distinction between the ethical and the moral in a moment. I'll be arguing that Williams is mistaken about this. I shall claim indeed that the very conceptual features of morality Williams identifies actually push against this thought. They help us to ground the distinction between what is advisable, either on broadly ethical or on more narrowly moral grounds, on the one hand, and what is morally obligatory on the other. Once we're clear about this distinction and its grounds, we have the conceptual space necessary to maintain a robust sphere of the morally permissible in which persons can pursue other ethical concerns on their own personal projects without violating what they're morally obligated to do, all things considered. Morality, I'll argue, does not enslave us. Williams tells us that the philosopher who is given the purest, deepest, and most thorough present representation of morality is Kant. Though I'll be defending morality from Williams's critique, I'll not be defending Kant. The reason is that Kant actually lacks the conceptual resources, as I'll try to show. Again, conceptual resources on which William himself insightfully insists, to make the distinction between moral obligation and moral choiceworthiness, and therefore to resist the shrinkage of the sphere of the permissible that is at the heart of Williams's abolitionist critique. As we'll see, for Kant, moral obligation only makes sense from the perspective of an imperfect rational agent who does not automatically do what they have most categorical reason, or as Kant says, what it is good for them to do. Moral obligation is simply the way practical reasons dictates, or the good, appear to a finite rational agent. More on this to come. It'll be helpful to note a distinction that Williams makes between ethics, conceived broadly, and morality, considered in the narrower, distinctively deontic or obligating sense he's arguing against. Williams takes ethics to be concerned broadly with what he calls Socrates' questions. How should one live? Any issue concerning how to act and feel is an ethical question in this broad sense, though Sam was convincing me about an hour ago that maybe he means just having, insofar as they concern other people's interests. But I don't think that matters for the point I'm trying to make. By contrast, William uses morality to refer to the distinctively deontic, or as Anscombe calls it, law conception, species of this genus that is concerned with questions of moral obligation, as he says, what is our duty? The narrower ethical conception of morality has, Williams remarks, a special significance in a modern Western culture, but it's something we should treat with a special skepticism. At the end of the day, he thinks, as I've said, that we'd be better off without it. Here again, I agree with Williams's historical claim, but disagree with the second ethical claim. In arguing for the abolition of morality, Williams is obviously not arguing for the abolition of ethics. To the contrary, Williams's abolitionism is itself at least partly an ethical position. In this way, it's like Nietzsche's critique of morality in the genealogy. Williams and Nietzsche both argued that the idea of morality carries indefensible presuppositions that derive from morality's conceptual connection to blame and guilt. For Williams, for Nietzsche, it's the indefensible assumption of freedom of the will. For Williams, it's morality's pretension of deliberative priority, that there can never be sufficient reason for culpable wrongdoing. So far, these critiques are philosophical without being ethical, but both critiques have an additional ethical element. For Nietzsche, it's the idea that morality involves self-deceptive, inauthentic, self-destructive, and life-denying, and we could add, as Brian was saying yesterday, ways of practices that eliminate or don't properly foster or support the most excellent forms of humanity. That's, I take it, an ethical critique of morality. For Williams, it's that living with morality shackles us in ways that prevent us from realizing important ethical values and the personal integrity of pursuing our ground projects. Both are ethical critiques of morality. In what follows, we'll need to keep in mind the distinction between the concept of morality on the one hand and the set of putatively obligating norms, which are the concept's object, on the other. The latter, the norms, are intrinsically normative, that is, if they're valid at all, and so not the sort of thing that could be abolished even if we wanted to. They're either normatively valid or they're not. It's most likely, though, that Williams is referring to the concept of morality, to morality as a distinctively problematic ethical conception, when he says we'd be better off without it. Now, even if he were right about that, proponents of morality might argue that such a fact could be impotent to make it any less true that morality obligates us. The right and the good are simply different ethical concepts, they might say, and neither is hostage to the other. It's hardly alien to our concept of morality, for example, that its requirements can conflict with self-interest. That seems part of the concept's DNA. Morality didn't promise you a rose garden. This response to Williams's critique is obviously too facile, though. The thought that we're better off collectively, if not individually, because we have the concept of morality, does lie close to the heart of the very idea. Even if morality never promised you a rose garden, it does seem to promise benefits to us together. In the moral point of view, for example, Kurt Beyer defines morality as consisting of universally teachable rules whose collective observation, quote, is for the good of everyone alike. Something like this idea was central to the thinking of the early modern moral philosophers who arguably first developed the idea of morality that Williams and Anscombe and Nietzsche are criticizing, at least in a systematic form. We can find it frequently with theological explanations in Locke, Butler, and Berkeley, just to name a few examples. On this story, since regulating our lives by conceptions of the good, especially eudaimonistic ones, is likely to lead to prisoner's dilemma-like problems of collective action, God solves these by giving us a conscience with the deontic conception of morality to override individual self-interest to our collective benefit. And any satisfying defense of morality must therefore take Williams's challenge seriously. If we really would be better off without the concepts that define it, then that would seem to undermine the morality system from within. Morality would have been revealed to be, in Kant's words, a chimerical idea without any truth. Now, a core plank of Williams's abolitionist critique is that there are conceptual pressures within the morality system that work to shrink the space of the morally permissible in which agents are morally free to pursue broader ethical concerns and their own ground projects. It's a mistake of morality, he says, to try to make everything valuable into an obligation. Thinking within the morality system encourages us, he thinks, to recast ethical considerations like those of gratitude that are better thought of in non-deontic terms as falling within the scope of moral obligation. And it encourages us as well to occlude any distinction between the morally advisable and the morally obligatory, holding that what is most morally choice-worthy must also be morally obligatory. Now, Williams believes, and I agree, that there's an important conceptual distinction between moral advisability or choice-worthiness on the one hand and moral obligation on the other. It's one thing for an act to be best supported by normative moral reasons and another for it to be morally obligatory. Williams himself says, it is hard to agree that the course of action which on a given occasion there's most moral reason to take must necessarily count as a moral obligation. Because, however, there's a very general connection between normative reasons and oughts of pretty much any kind, this conceptual distinction can be easy to miss. So, for example, what we ought to believe is what there, it seems, what there's most normative reason to believe. Similarly, what we ought to desire is what there's most normative reason to desire. Similarly, also, what we ought to do, what is most choice-worthy, is what there is most normative reason to do or choose. It seems obviously to follow that what we morally ought to do, that is, what is most morally choice-worthy, is simply what we have most moral reason to do. This much should be uncontroversial. Since we sometimes refer to our moral obligations as what we morally ought to do, however, it may seem to follow also that what we have most moral reason to do is also what we're morally obligated to do. But this doesn't follow. And the reason it doesn't follow is one that Williams is especially attuned to, namely, again, the conceptual connection between moral obligation and accountability and justified blame, which the idea of a normative reason, even the idea of a normative moral reason, doesn't have. To see this doesn't follow, we only have to imagine the possibility of a coherent disagreement between two people who agree that a given action is best supported by moral reasons, that is most morally choice-worthy, and in that sense, what the agent morally ought to do, but who disagree about whether the action is morally obligatory. So imagine, for example, a disagreement between an act consequentialist and someone like Scheffler in the rejection of consequentialism. They agree that the morally best thing to do is always what will be optimistic, what will have the best consequences overall. They both reject so-called agent-relative deontological constraints, but the act consequentialist thinks it's always wrong not to do what will be optimistic, and Scheffler thinks that, well, no, it's not always wrong. Sometimes it's not wrong if there's sufficient agent cost. So he accepts what he calls it, at that point, I guess, agent-centered prerogative. Now we say agent-relative prerogative or agent-relative permission. All I'm saying now is that's a coherent view. If it's a coherent view, then the two people can't be meaning by moral obligation what there's most moral reason to do, because they agree that there's most moral reason to do this thing, and they're disagreed about whether it's morally obligatory. So what is this disagreement about? Well, my diagnosis of the disagreement is essentially Williams's. What's morally obligatory is what we're accountable for doing, in the sense that we would be blameworthy for failing to do it without excuse. So what the issue between the act consequentialist and the Schefflerian is whether it's always blameworthy to fail to do the optimistic thing when you lack an excuse. So I think what this shows is that, first, you can't understand the idea of moral obligation in terms of the idea of moral reasons. I think there's also an interesting question of how to understand the idea of a moral reason, and on another occasion I try to argue that actually the best way of understanding that is looped back to moral obligation, but let's not worry about that. Moral deontic terms like required, obligatory, prohibited, wrong, permissible, and the like, rights, wrongs, wronging, doing right by, and so on, all of those, occupy a different conceptual space than do those concerning what reasons favor, support, or justify even moral reasons, since the former distinctively concern accountability, and the latter do not. Now, that doesn't mean that deontic claims don't hook up with normative reasons claims. On any plausible account of moral reasons, it should turn out that what is morally obligatory, all things considered, is also what there's most moral reason to do. But the contrary doesn't follow. Presently, we'll be considering Williams's abolitionist case for thinking that the morality system includes pressures to close the gap between the morally advisable and the morally obligatory. But at this point anyway, it should seem that nothing in the concept of moral obligation pushes us in this direction, indeed quite the contrary. That this is so is a consequence of a distinction that was first made, I think, in the 17th century by the Spanish natural lawyer Francisco Suarez between what he called law on the one hand and counsel on the other. Hobbes also makes a distinction between law or command on the one hand and counsel on the other. This distinction was carried forward in early modern moral philosophy, especially in Grotius, Hobbes, and Kant, and it's now enshrined, I think, in moral common sense. Suarez noted that the deontic concepts of law and obligation have distinctive entailments of accountability that are not shared by the concept of what he called counsel, or good advice, or what's advisable, or normative reasons. No matter how weighty the reasons, the claim that moral reasons recommend or counsel an action is a claim of a different kind than the deontic claim that an action is morally obligatory, required, or demanded. Similarly, the claim that an action is morally permissible, not obligatory, not to do, cannot be seamlessly translated into the language of moral reasons. Although Suarez was in many ways a classical natural lawyer, he thought that Aquinas' version left out what he called natural laws or moralities, power to obligate those subject to it by authoritatively addressing demands to them which they're accountable for complying with. So, passage from Suarez, counsel is excluded from law. The word promulgation, which is inherent to law, implies an order for the purpose of creating an obligation, and it is in this respect, most of all, that counsel differs from law, that is, in not being promulgated and obligation creating. Now, like some modern natural lawyers to follow, including Lundt's own Pufendorf and Locke, Suarez thought that any such obligation could only result from God's authoritative commands. So Suarez tied being subject to the moral law to being accountable to God's superior authority for compliance. If we don't voluntarily observe the law, he wrote, we are legal culprits in the sight of God, that is, culpable, and God can hold us accountable. But Suarez's theological voluntarism was not essential to his distinction between law and counsel. The crucial divide is between deontic concepts like law, authority, command, and obligation, which are conceptually tied to accountability, and culpability on the one hand, and the idea of normative reasons counting in favor of or counseling action, which is not, on the other. Consistently with the conceptual connection between law and accountability, we might be accountable for complying with the moral law, even if the latter didn't depend on divine command. We might, for example, be accountable to one another and ourselves as representative persons or members of the moral community, just for one view. Kant was one of the modern moral philosophers who explicitly notes Suarez's distinction between law and counsel. As I said, I'll be arguing that this distinction, when taken together with an appreciation of the second personal character of accountability, provides resources for resisting Williams's abolitionist critique. It'll turn out, however, that though Kant acknowledges Suarez's distinction, there's simply no place in his ethics for distinguishing between what obligating moral law requires on the one hand and what deontic normative moral reasons recommend, that is, counsel in Suarez's terms, on the other. Thus, Kant himself lacks the resources to resist Williams's abolitionist critique. I turn now to laying out the second personal aspects of Williams's four key features. The Suarezian distinction between law and counsel underwrites Williams's first feature, namely the distinctive deontic concepts of law and obligation that lie at the center of the morality system and, as Anscombe put it, modern moral philosophy. The signal feature of morality as an ethical conception is the idea that not only are there ways we should live in the broadly ethical sense of there being normative reasons for so acting, and that or that it would be good so to act, but that there are ways we are morally obligated to act such that failures don't simply fall short of some ideal, nor, for that matter, realize some negative ideal, like the contemptible or the base, but rather constitute violations of demands that morality makes of us. It is, I argue, law and obligation's connection to legitimate claims and demands that puts us into the sphere of the second personal. Unlike ideals, either positive ideals or negative ideals, claims and demands are in their nature addressable to those of and to whom they're made. Suarez effectively notes this himself when he says that the idea of law implies promulgation. Moral demands are addressed to us. It's a reflection of this that we think of conscience not simply as the seat of ethical conviction, but as a voice that holds us to account. Ultimately, I'll argue our voice from a certain perspective. Williams's second feature is precisely this connection between moral obligation and accountability, specifically the holding accountable attitude of blame. This was the feature, again, that we needed to explain the intelligibility of the disagreement between the act consequentialist and the Schefflerian defender of agent-relative prerogatives or permissions. What ultimately underlies the Suarezian distinction between law and counsel is the former's connection to accountability and culpability, culprits, as he puts it. It's a conceptual truth. If you're looking for a slogan to sort of encapsulate this thought, it's a conceptual truth that we're morally obligated to do something if and only if it's an act of a kind that it would be blameworthy to omit without excuse. Accountability and blame are second personal in their nature. This is the fundamental point driving Strawson's argument in Freedom and Resentment. When we have reactive attitudes like blame, we take up a distinctive, as he puts it, participant standpoint, one of participation in a relationship with the blamed, even if only the relationship of fellow person, and implicitly relate to them second personally. So second personal doesn't necessarily mean another person. It means the addressing relation, relating to. We can do that to ourselves when we feel guilt, I think. We do not see them from a third personal or objective point of view from which issues of causation and determinism loom large. Blame makes a putatively legitimate demand of the blamed, bids for their recognition of the demand's legitimacy, a point, by the way, that Williams himself explicitly states, and I'll come back to that later. Blame seeks acknowledgement. That's the idea. So it seeks acknowledgement of the demand's legitimacy and the authority to make it, and bids for the other to hold themselves accountable and take responsibility for what they've done. Blame thus comes with what I call an RSVP. It insinuates what Colleen McNamara calls a call and response structure, so it's always implicitly reciprocal. It's the second personal character of reactive attitudes like moral blame that necessitates the Strawsonian presuppositions of competency and will, as what Gary Watson first called constraints of moral address. Blame, at least of the kind that Miranda calls communicative blame, is simply unintelligible, except on the assumption that its object can understand and accept the legitimacy of the demand it implicitly makes, and that they can hold themselves accountable from the same standpoint of fellow person or member of the moral community that we take up in blaming them. Here, by the way, I should make clear, I'm talking about blame the attitude, not necessarily about blaming as a social act. Blaming can be motivated by all kinds of things, but blaming is taken to express the attitude. It may not actually express the attitude, but it's taken to express the attitude. It's the attitude I'm interested in. I think that's what Strawson was interested in also. These are distinctive human emotions and attitudes. To be subject to moral obligations, therefore, an agent must have a conscience. That is, the capacity to take up the moral point of view and make demands of themselves from this perspective. They must be capable of self-reactive attitudes, like guilt, for example. The voice of conscience is not an alien one. It's a voice we ourselves share as one moral agent among others. Now, this links to Williams's third feature, moral obligations' putative deliberative priority. This is what Scheffler once called morality's claim of overridingness. There can never be sufficient reason to do what morality forbids. There are several aspects to this claim that make it particularly interesting. First, claims about moral obligation are not themselves claims about what one has most or sufficient reason to do. We've sort of already seen a point in that direction. But though moral obligations claims are not about what one has reason to do, they seem to have implications for that. And the reason they do, again, is obligations' conceptual link to blameworthiness. This is Williams's fourth point about morality. Moral obligations' putative deliberative priority is owing to the nature and presuppositions of blame. So the basic thought here is there's Williams of internal and external reasons, and that gives a kind of argument for internalism that's really quite general about reasoning. You could completely reject that idea and still accept what I take to be the argument of internal reasons and the obscurity of blame, that blame does presuppose the existence of a reason for the person not to have acted as they're being blamed for doing. It's a point Williams emphasizes that it's incoherent to blame someone for doing something one thinks they had sufficient normative reason to do. some kind of contradiction or incoherence seems to be involved. After all, if someone can establish that they had sufficient reason, then they'll have adequately accounted for themselves. They will have justified what they did. Blame must therefore assume that they can't, that there was not sufficient reason for doing what they did. If an act is morally obligatory, all things considered, then I've been claiming it's conceptually necessary that it's an act of a kind that would be blameworthy to fail to perform without excuse. But if that's so, it just follows that the act must be one we cannot have sufficient reason to omit, because if we did, that would show that the blame would be unjustified. Before we consider the details of Williams's abolitionist argument, we should note that although morality must insist on the deliberative priority of all things considered obligations, it has no stake at all in the idea that moral reasons necessarily are weightier or outweigh normative reasons of other kinds, or that there is always reason to do all things considered whatever there's most moral reason to do. There's no stake in that idea. Morality's claim of overriding us only concerns binding deontic moral norms, all things considered. Morality need take no stand on the relative weight of moral and non-moral reasons in general. At one point, however, Williams says that the purest Kantian view locates the importance of morality in the thought that people should give moral considerations the highest deliberative priority. Here again, Williams may turn out to be right about Kant, as we'll see, but wrong about morality. There are aspects of Williams's critique that are very much on target and that we should not resist. I'm just going to pass over this. He has this stuff on Ross on gratitude, and Ross tries to make gratitude into an obligation or duty, and Williams says that's as I had put it, that's inappropriately deontologizing something that's valuable in a different way. The motivation of gratitude is not respect for the just claims of the person, for gratitude the other person has. It's some kind of love or expression of appreciation. I think you can explain this actually once you really take on board this distinction between the morally advisable and the morally obligatory and see what grounds that distinction. Focusing on obligations' conceptual connection to accountability can actually help keep deontic moral philosophers to stay in their lanes and not try to deontologize aspects of the ethical life whose valuable is incompatible with the deontic. I turn now to Williams's argument that morality's focus on obligation leads to its dominating overreach. It's important to be clear that Williams's claims concern all things considered moral obligations, not pro tanto, or as Ross called them, prima facie obligations. Williams takes it to be a defining feature of moral obligations that they can't conflict ultimately, really, or at the end of the day. Obviously, this can only be true of all things considered obligations. A prima facie obligation, Williams says, is only, quote, a candidate for being one's actual obligation. Now, Williams gives three main lines of argument. Putting aside for the moment one of these, which concerns morality's putative deliberative priority, which I'll come back to later, let's consider the two elements that Williams thinks leads to morality's claim that we're never free of moral obligations, sort of the ubiquity claim. One, Williams expresses with the formula, only an obligation can beat an obligation. Let's just call that OBO. Williams considers a case in which one has made a promise to visit a friend, but is, quote, presented with a unique opportunity at a conflicting time and place to further significantly some important cause. Suppose we agree that although your promise generated an obligation, pro tanto, prima facie, it would not be wrong to break the promise if that's necessary to further the cause. Okay. Williams argues then that, quote, because obligations have a moral stringency, which means breaking them attracts blame, the only way we can justify breaking such a promise within the economy of morality is to hypothesize a more stringent obligation, in this case, to further the important cause. Here we encounter the second feature of morality that drives Williams's argument. There can be an obligation to aid in this particular cause, Williams says, only if there's a general obligation to assist some important cause on occasions that are especially propitious for assisting it. Williams concludes that there is, quote, a demand within the morality system to find a general obligation to back any particular one. He calls this the obligation out, obligation in principle, we can call it OOOI. Taken together, these two core tenets of the morality system, OBO and OOOI, that's actually the last time we're going to say that, so I don't even know. But it might help you keep track of it. These two leading inexorably to morality's dominating overreach. Since we can virtually never be free of propitious circumstances to do good, we're never free of moral obligations. Morality becomes the peculiar institution by which we're all enslaved. But is it true that only an obligation can beat another obligation? What Williams says underlies this putatively central feature of the morality system is what he calls the special stringency of moral obligation, that violating it attracts blame, and that blame presupposes deliberative priority. But that's only true of all things considered moral obligations. If a pro tanto obligation doesn't end up being what one is obligated to do, all things considered, then failing to comply with it need not be culpable. I mean, to the contrary. If one is morally obligated to do something else instead, then it will be culpable, lacking excuse to comply with the initial pro tanto obligation. Clearly, the sense of obligation that Williams requires for OBO, I lied. I say OBO again. I didn't think I would. Sorry. Only an obligation can beat an obligation is pro tanto rather than all things considered. Otherwise, it does no work in the argument. By definition, an all things considered obligation can't be beaten by another obligation. If it could, it wouldn't be your all things considered obligation. The special stringency of all things considered obligations obviously can't support in any way a claim about what it takes to defeat a pro tanto obligation. So that argument won't work, but maybe it's still true that morality is committed to OBO, that only an obligation can beat an obligation. To see that it's not, consider a special instance of the kind of case that Williams is considering that was brought forward by Francis Cam in the very same year, actually, that Ethics and the Limits was published in 1985. Suppose that on the way to see the friend you've promised to visit, you encounter an awful accident that has left the victim needing a kidney. Right, so you remember the Thompson case, right? So Cam's case is just a combination of the Williams case with the Cam case. I mean, with the Thompson case. Cam says, as Judy Thompson does about her famous violinist case, that one would not be obligated to donate the kidney. Be morally good to do so, but you wouldn't be obligated to do it. Okay. Now her point here is that even though one is not obligated to come to the accident victim's aid, it's clearly morally permissible to do so, despite the fact that you've promised to visit your friend. So despite the fact that doing so will require you to fail to discharge the pro tanto obligation you had that was created by the promise. Here, the pro tanto obligation to keep one's promise is beaten by something other than an obligation, presumably by the strong but not obligating moral reasons created by the accident victim's need. What Cam says seems clearly right. Or more modestly, there seems nothing in the conceptual features of the morality system that dictate otherwise. Quite to the contrary, in fact. If we keep clearly in mind that the question of what we're obligated to do is in its nature a question of a different kind than what we have good or most normative reason to do, even most moral reason, then it should seem obvious how the space for Cam's diagnosis opens up. What is morally obligatory is what someone is justifiably held accountable for doing. And that is simply a different matter from what actions moral reasons most recommend. This, again, is simply Suarez's distinction between moral law and counsel. When we focus on this conceptual point, we see space for thinking that pro tanto moral obligations can be trumped not just by weighty moral reasons, but also by pro tanto permissions or prerogatives. So much is already implied, indeed, in the Thompson case. Right? So we could all agree that there's a pro tanto obligation to save anyone's life, but then in this case, that pro tanto obligation gets defeated by the fact that doing so would require inordinate cost, and it's not to the agent, and it's not cost that can be reasonably required of them. Now, and that such a claim would be clearly consistent with thinking that, for example, in Singer's famous pond case, one would be morally obligated, all things considered, to rescue. Defenders of morality can easily accept, indeed proclaim, that there is a general pro tanto obligation to do good or meet need, and so accept Williams's OOOI. There I go again. But they should then agree with Cam and Thompson that such pro tanto moral obligations can be defeated by sufficiently high costs to the agent. This amounts to the same thing as saying that pro tanto obligations can be outweighed by pro tanto agent relative permissions or prerogatives, as well as by other pro tanto obligations. It's again the conceptual connection between deontic moral concepts and accountability, what I call their second personal character, that opens up this space to resist OBO and thereby a crucial plank of Williams's abolitionist critique. In the Cam and Thompson cases, the cost to the agent defeat what would otherwise be morally obligatory because they're costs that would be unreasonable to demand and hold people accountable for bearing. The final plank of Williams's abolitionist critique is his argument against moral obligations' putative deliberative priority. He agrees that morality must claim deliberative priority, owing first to obligations' conceptual connection to accountability, to blame, and second to the fact that, as he agrees, blame necessarily presupposes that its object had sufficient reason not to do what they're being blamed for doing, the wrongful act. Since Williams believes that all normative reasons are internal, anchored in the agent's motivational set, S, this amounts, he thinks, to mere bluff in any situation in which the blamed agent lacks the relevant desires. Of course, there's a lot of elbow room there, wiggle room. Clearly, this critique, however, rests squarely on Williams's claim that all reasons must be internal reasons. Now, I think it'd be much too facile for defenders of morality to seek to take refuge in externalism of some kind here. The reason is, as Williams himself appreciates, that whatever the rationale for internalism about normative reasons in general, the character of holding accountable attitudes like moral blame necessitates some kind of internalism about moral obligations in particular. The reason is that blame presupposes not just that the blamed agent had good reason and sufficient reason not to do the blamed thing, but they also could have been motivated by those considerations. That seems sort of built into the Strawsonian framework. Now, it would be too fast, sorry, I just said that. In Internal Reasons in the Obscurity of Blame, Williams develops his critique, but then notes that it's possible to create the reasons that blame presupposes proleptically. He observes that, quote, blame asks for acknowledgement. That's the point I was putting before about blame always has an RSVP or has a call and response quality to it. And it's just a deep point about the reactive attitudes as opposed to other critical attitudes, which don't necessarily have that reciprocal interpersonal structure. Contempt, for example, doesn't. Disesteem, esteem, a whole set of other sort of evaluative attitudes. So Williams's idea, though, is that when the object of blame lacks an internal reason, blame can function proleptically to create it via the blamed agent's desire to be respected by those they respect. Blame makes vivid that non-compliance puts mutual respect at risk and so can strengthen internal reasons to comply. Williams concludes that this is the way that blame can hope to achieve recognition and give the blamed agents reasons without falling into moralistic bluster and force. But I think this mistakes the way that reciprocal recognition enters into blame. Blame doesn't seek compliance as a kind of tribute, as the price of reciprocal recognition and good standing. As Strawson himself points out, reactive attitudes already express recognition of the other as an equal. Strawson says they continue to view him as a member of the moral community, only as one who is offended against its demands. The acknowledgement that blame calls for is of the legitimacy of the demand that it implicitly addresses as part of the addressees holding themselves accountable. Blame seeks an acknowledgement that expresses an internal acceptance that the wrongness of the agent's conduct itself provided or entailed good reason not to have done it. This does indeed presuppose that those who are subject to obligation and can therefore be objects of justified blame must have the capacity to be moved by their internal acceptance of their culpability. That is, by reactive attitudes that they can have towards themselves. Guilt, or what Strawson also calls a sense of obligation. Now, one, but not the only way this can happen is through empathic internalization of somebody else's blame. So, I do something and you blame me for it. If I am able to put myself in your perspective and see myself as blameworthy from that perspective, and if I see it not just as that's the way it seems to you from your perspective, but see it as what would be a sensible way to view me from a perspective we can share as equal moral agents, then I feel the self-addressed attitude towards myself, and I feel guilt. And guilt is not, gee, I feel bad, I want to avoid feeling bad. Guilt is the pained sense that one shouldn't have done what one did. And that's a motivating attitude. And so blame may well presuppose that the objects of blame have the capacity to internalize blame in that way, and not just see it as, they've got to stop acting that way to gain other people's respect. They should stop acting that way because they shouldn't be acting that way, as they can see when they view themselves sympathetically or empathically from the perspective they share with the person who's blaming them. So this hostage to motivational capacity is something morality should be quite happy to accept, indeed proclaim. Only beings with a conscience can be moral agents in this sense. This doesn't mean that people were always effectively motivated by their conscience, but they have to have some kind of motivational purchase on the concept. This gives moral agents everything necessary both to recognize sufficient reasons to comply with moral obligations and to be moved to do so. Then in conclusion, I'd like to say something about why Kant's ethics lack the resources, as I've been arguing fundamentally second personal in their nature, to resist Williams's critique. The reason is that although Kant employs the Suarezian categories of law and counsel, he does so not within the category of the moral, but rather as marking the distinction between what he calls counsels of prudence on the one hand and commands, laws of morality on the other. Counsels of prudence are what he calls assertoric hypothetical imperatives that say what an agent ought to do in order to realize their desire for happiness. For Kant, morality exhausts the category of categorical reasons and vice versa. We've seen how defenders of morality can take advantage of obligation's conceptual connection to accountability to argue for a space within which individuals may permissibly act against what moral reasons alone would recommend in order to pursue things they care about for other reasons. They may do so if it would be unreasonable to hold them accountable for doing otherwise. Although Kant uses Suarez's vocabulary, he can't countenance any distinction between what moral reasons recommend and what morality requires. The reason is that for Kant, morality's requirements are simply the way that categorical practical reasons appear to imperfect rational beings like us who have sources of motivation other than pure practical reason. Oughts and imperatives, he says, quote, say that to do or omit something would be good, but they say it to a will that does not always do something just because it is represented to it that it would be good to do that thing. Perfect rational beings don't have deontic concepts. They don't need them, like obligation, ought, and imperatives, in Kant's view. I don't think that's true of perfect rational beings, but I think that's the way Kant's thinking about it. The only objects of pure practical reason, he says, are those of the good and the evil. Das Gute and das Böse. Moral obligation for Kant is ultimately a psychological process, one he calls necessitation, through which imperfect rational beings are motivated to do what is good by the feeling of respect for what reason presents to them as commands. A perfectly good will, he says, would just as much stand under objective laws of the good, but it would not be represented as thereby necessitated to actions that conform with what he would call moral laws, because it can of itself, according to its subjective constitution, be determined only by the representation of the good. We, however, need deontic moral concepts, he thinks, to be adequately motivated. It's only, Kant says, to the human being that pure reason gives, quote, a universal law which we call the moral law. This gives us no further reasons, only motivation through respect for reason's commands to do what we already have sufficient reason to do. Now, I do think there's a problem here about how to understand the idea that reason can command us to do stuff, but let's leave that to one side. This means that Kant can't resist Williams's abolitionist critique. For Kant, moral obligation really does expand to whatever there's most categorical reason to do. Williams is right that this would be unreasonably constraining. However, once we fully appreciate the second personal character of the conceptual connection between moral obligation and accountability, we see that morality's obligations could not be so ubiquitously constraining, since it would not simply be unreasonable to hold people accountable for complying with such ubiquitous demands. It can't be the case that morality demands this. Although Kant can't escape Williams's abolitionist critique, therefore, morality can. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Just before we proceed to the Q&A, a couple of practical points. The first one is I promised that I would ask if people mind if they have their photographs taken during this session. This is for the website, is it?
Yeah. So a few of us are sort of taking photos during the entire event. So it would be good to ask if someone really doesn't want their picture taken.
Does anybody take exception?
I want last Photoshop rights.
Good, okay, thanks. So, and the second practical point is that, as you can see, I'm using a roving mic, and I'm going to propose that we use this for the question and answer session as well. So if you can wait until you've got the microphone in front of you before you ask your questions. So, first question.
Hi, thanks, Steve. I'm curious what you think the CAM case tells us about the connection between obligations and blame on your view. So I was thinking about a different version of this case. So suppose I promise you to come to your party.
Yep.
And then afterwards I realize that I really don't want to go. In fact, I don't want to go so much that I'd give a kidney to not come to your party. And so on my way there, I see this person who needs a kidney. And I don't really care about this person and whether they survive. All I'm interested in is whether I can come up with a good excuse for not going to your party. And so that's what I do, right? I give my kidney and stay away.
Okay.
Now, I'm not sure in this case that I'm not blameworthy. It seems to me there's something pretty blameworthy about the way that I come to donate my kidney, which, on your view, seems to imply that there was some kind of obligation in play. So do you want to say that there's either that I'm not blameworthy or that there is an obligation still in play? In which case, how does the prerogative defeat the obligation?
Well, I think there are two versions of this case we should consider. So just stop with the idea that you really don't want to go to the party so much that you'd be willing to give a kidney for it, and there's nothing about you actually do give the kidney, right? So you might think, well, that's a lot of agent cost, right? And if it's sufficient agent cost to defeat the obligation to give the kidney, presumably it might be sufficient agent cost to wipe the obligation to keep the promise. I need take no stand on this normative issue. I'm inclined to think that the mere fact that you really don't want to keep the promise is usually not a sufficient ground to defeat the obligation. Okay. Now we'll keep the videotape running. Okay. And so now it's not just the fact that you really don't want to go to the extent that you'd be willing to give a kidney. Well, you really would give a kidney. Okay. So you do give the kidney, right? Are you blameworthy for giving the kidney? No. No, you're not, for the very reasons that Cam says. And I think in that case, we don't look to the motivation of why you give it. You know, you might, so this is I think, mostly a point about blame. I could agree with you. I mean, actually, I could agree for these purposes. Nothing I say here rules out the possibility that you could be blameworthy for giving the kidney for that reason. That's consistent with everything I'm saying. I'm not sure whether to say that or to say, you know, you're not morally estimable. That's clear. And when you think about, I would, you know, I mean, I guess I'm working myself into thinking that there's something like blameworthiness for being such as to be motivated in that way, only to do it, you know, for that reason. Yes, I don't have a horse in that race in particular, and I don't know that my theory gives clear guidance one way or the other in that. It frames the question as what would it be reasonable to demand of people, and I do think yeah, I can see arguments going both ways there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Much some food for thought here. I was just wondering, when it comes to, I mean, Williams for me is very well known for the idea of that we sort of face moral dilemmas, no?
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could say maybe something more about how this, your idea, I mean, Williams' idea about blame and accountability should be seen if you really think that someone is facing a moral dilemma.
Yeah. Well, I crossed out one sentence where I talked about moral dilemmas, but wouldn't really help to this point. I think what the view says, and I think Williams would probably say this as well, and I'd say it, is if you really believe in moral dilemmas, you believe, so the moral dilemma consists in the case that you do wrong, whichever you do, A or B, okay? Then I think what that amounts to is you end up being blameworthy, whether you do A or whether you do B. And I think that's the felt sense of a moral dilemma. It's not just, gee, there are kind of reasons on both sides that weigh equally, and I can't break a tie here. No, there's a demand that I not do this, and there's a demand that I not do that, and the way that feels is whatever I do, I'll be blameworthy. It'll be culpable.
So you have a sort of idea that this person is accountable in
Yeah, I would have thought so. I mean, I think that's the way it'll feel to them. They'll feel guilt. Now, you know, I think So
sorry, no, but from the point of the view of the person blaming the person, no? So would I really regard this person as blameworthy in a moral dilemma?
Yeah. I think it depends on whether you think there's a genuine moral dilemma there.
Okay, let's say that I think that it's
so if you really think it's a moral dilemma, then I think, yeah, it just goes with that you think that the person is blameworthy. In other words, I just throw the question back to you. So what does it mean that they're in a dilemma? So I need to know what the normative consequences are of they're doing wrong. So is it doing wrong, but it wouldn't be culpable, lacking excuse, or is that?
But I mean, as I take moral dilemmas, I mean, you're doing something right at the same time as you're doing something bad, no? That's one way of regarding a moral dilemma, no?
Yeah.
So
well, maybe so here's another point that I think is actually pretty important. So blame and praise are not contraries, in my view. Blame is the holding accountable attitude. And when you do wrong, you do something that justifies blame lacking excuse. It's not as if doing something right is sort of like a positive thing you get to balance against the doing wrong thing. If it's wrong, it's wrong. Now, it could be that you do, if it's possible to do wrong, whatever you do, then, yeah, well, that's the tragic nature of a dilemma. And if there, I don't myself, I have no stake in thinking there are moral dilemmas, but if there are, it seems to me that's the form that they would take. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. This is not really central to the claims you were making, but I was just very, very struck by your claim that Kant lacks the resource to make sense of the distinction between choice-worthiness and obligation.
Right.
So I just wanted to. I'm kind of quite nervous to speak for Kant in the Williams conference, but anyway. So I thought the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties was the device with which to do that. So the perfect duties are narrow and it prohibits. Whereas imperfect duties sort of widens, defines a range of things within which you can choose, and that's the duties that permit you to.
Right. Well, so the distinction, as I understand it, in Kant, and there are different ways of drawing this distinction. Sometimes people do it in terms of what you can be coerced to do, and so on. Kant doesn't do it in that way. He does it in terms of obligated to perform a particular act versus obligated to make something your end. Okay.
That's not the distinction between perfect and imperfect duty. That's the distinction between wide and narrow.
Wide and narrow. How are you thinking he's making it?
Well, so perfect and imperfect duty, as I thought, was a distinction within the narrow duty. That is, duties having to do with ethics rather than law. Duty having to do with virtue. I think narrow-wide distinction having to do has to do with law.
So it really is this sort of what you can be coerced to do versus what. So that if the idea of a perfect duty comes up as the analog of a perfect right, okay, in the doctrine of right sense, then it doesn't concern anything about what's on the table here, because it just concerns what you could be justifiably coerced to do.
Yeah,
okay.
But I'm not talking about anything in that doctrinal right side of things. I'm just talking about the distinction that Kant has in the doctrinal virtue side of things.
Okay.
Namely, so for instance, duty of respect is a perfect duty.
Okay.
It prohibits me from acting on a maxim that goes against that.
Right.
Whereas perfection of my talents, that's an imperfect duty, but it's a moral duty. But I can choose within the range of that imperfect duty whether to cultivate my musical talent or whether to cultivate my athletic talent. So it permits me. Any of these things I'm permitted to do.
Right. So I take it what's going on there is you are strictly obligated to develop your talents, okay? But you may choose which of your talents to develop. There's a Spielraum there.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. But
so there's the sort of distinction between the level of specificity of the ends, and that's another way to sort of make the distinction.
Right. Okay. Good. Well, yeah, I don't see how that's working because suppose I think it's better for me to develop my piano versus my tennis or something like that. Okay. Then it looks like the passages I was referring to will, from the point of view of the duty to develop my talents, okay, it looks like it's open to develop them in various ways. But if it turns out to be better for me to determine to do it in this way rather than that way, then maybe I guess the way I'd put it is the passages I'm pointing to put pressure on the idea that I'm completely permitted to develop whichever one I choose.
So you're thinking, so you say you, so yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry.
All the way back here. Cheers, Adrian. Stephen, thanks so much. Super interesting, and in a way, I think I'm quite sympathetic to what the program you're on. I'm thinking even Williams, in some ways, might be sympathetic to something you might, if I read you properly or understand you properly, it could be almost seen as something of an effort at a reconciliation with Williams, a kind of showing that, look, we can take on board a lot of the really forceful criticism here, and as it were, looking in the other direction towards you. I can imagine Williams saying something like, well, you know, you're quite right, because actually, despite the kind of all the talk about we'd be better off with morality, better off without morality, he actually, as you know, had a kind of regard for it and regard for its values, and spoke at the end of Ethics and Limits of Philosophy as this is really a significant law. So I can imagine him being sympathetic to the project. And I can see that what you can say is, look, Kantianism is vulnerable, utilitarianism is vulnerable, but we're still talking about morality, and there's a lot that's worth saving here, so we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
But I wonder, this is partly, Stephen, a way of asking you for interpretation of where you stand, and I wonder about this analogy. A friend of mine years and years ago wrote a paper called Chess and Life. And so the idea was that morality was sort of kind of could be modeled on the idea of chess. And I think this is sympathetic to your interpretation. I'm kind of interested if this is. So the idea here would be that think of ethics like chess in relation to life. There are rules that require certain moves. There are moves you can make and that you can't make. So there's what's required and what's impermissible. But there's an awful lot, as it were, of strategy, if you want counsel, the scope for choice, that you can still keep. You know, you're a better player if you move this way, and you're a worse player if you move that way. But it's not required by the rules that you must move that way or impermissible. So the question I've got a little bit here is partly to you, but also if you see this as a way of sort of, my thought about this is that Williams would still be, if that model is representative of your view, that's part of my question. And then maybe you can see where I'm going with this is, I still think that Williams wouldn't like that model.
Yeah, I don't like that either, but yeah.
Okay,
good.
that's...
Right. So, yeah, so, but I'd like the thought of sort of trying out reconciliation here. Right, so Williams certainly wants a notion of rights, and he acknowledges that any such notion, and let's say human rights, not just rights that are conventionally defined within some society, but the idea of human rights, let's say. And he acknowledges that that requires a notion of obligation as a correlative to those rights. So claim rights have obligations as their correlative. So if they're human rights, there got to be human obligations. And around that same point in Ethics and the Limits, there's a nod to Scanlon and contractualism as sort of promising there. So if you put that bit together with the conceptual claims, then I think we're roughly on the same page. It's when Williams says that, well, so there is the rhetoric about the morality system. And so one of the things that came out yesterday in Matthew's talk was this drive within the morality system to shelter from luck, okay? And notice that really didn't play any role in chapter 10. And I didn't have anything to say about that. And I've been thinking about that since yesterday. And you know, I'm inclined to say there's a certain kind of luck avoidance that's built into the very idea of a certain kind of reciprocal blame. But beyond that, that seems not really to be what this conception of morality is really about. It's more about, as I was saying yesterday, is sort of mirrored in the debate between luck egalitarians and relational egalitarians. It's the view that morality is fundamentally about relations between persons. Now, that doesn't mean that it's only about how we treat persons as opposed to other animals or maybe even the environment, but it's sort of deeply connected there. Now, I don't know. It'd be great if we had Bernard here with us and we could talk about this and sort of figure this out. But I think there's some of the aspirations he takes morality to have, it need not have. And I'm not sure, I'd love to know what he thought about, you know, these counterexamples to it takes an obligation to beat an obligation. But I'd be hopeful that we could come to some meeting of the minds about that. Yeah. Oh, but about chess. The problem with the chess analogy, when you violate the rules of chess, there's a problem about whether you're even playing chess at that point. it's part of the very idea of the morality system that when you violate rules of morality, you're certainly within the morality system. You're at a particular point in it. You've done something culpable. And there's no notion of the culpable in the rules of chess, right? So life, there's chess. There's the morality of chess playing, which will have to have this notion of accountability and culpability in it. Notice that the rules of chess don't have accountability in them. And then there's morality more, not just in playing chess, but in relating to one another more generally.
Thank you very much. This last thing you said was really interesting, so now I'm confused as to what I wanted to ask you about. My question is really narrow, actually. I just wanted to better understand the claim that blame is second personal.
Yeah.
How strong the claim, in particular, that moral agents can hold themselves accountable in their own consciousness. Good. And what bears on that can? Because I was thinking that I just thought about 4 cases, but surely there are more. But in one case, I blame you and you knew that what you were doing was wrong. Yeah. Or you didn't think about it, but you could have thought about it.
And was I negligent in not thinking about it?
Yes.
Yes.
Let's
good.
say.
Okay.
Or that you couldn't think about it, but after discussing with me, you, I don't know, end up believing that what I value is also something that you could value. Or that you cannot, you could have not thought about it, and you cannot not actually understand why I'm blaming you. And I was just wondering whether in all of these 4 cases, it would be a legitimate thing for me to blame you, or if in the last 2, not really, because you were not actually, you couldn't actually hold yourself accountable in your own conscience. Yeah.
Well, first, let me try to say something about why blame has this sort of self-addressing of a demand feature to it. And so take the distinction between guilt and shame. We were talking about shame yesterday. I take it that guilt and shame differ crucially in this respect, that guilt feels as if you violated a legitimate demand, and when you feel it, you feel not just that somebody is in a position to blame you, but you feel as if you are to blame. That is blamable roughly from a perspective that you yourself can share. And then the Strawson idea is that blame implicitly makes a demand of its object. And again, it comes with this RSVP. Shame doesn't work in that way, I don't think. So the natural expression of guilt is something like making amends, confession, some kind of address, acknowledgement of the other. The way that shame typically feels is something like withdrawing, hiding your face, removing your social presence. And if there's a, it's interesting question we were talking about at dinner last night. What's the reciprocal attitude to shame as blame is to guilt? Well, it might be something like contempt. And if it is, contempt doesn't have this RSVP character to it. To the contrary, the person who has contempt is not interested particularly in a response from the person about whom they have contempt. And I like to use this example from Hume. Hume has this marvelous phrase, egregious blockhead, right? Okay, so being an egregious, our Hume scholar here just left. Egregious, when you think that someone's egregious blockhead, there's no and when you have contempt for them as an egregious blockhead, there's no Strawsonian presupposition that they have to be in a position to appreciate that they're an egregious blockhead. To the contrary, if that's even more contemptible if they don't have that. Okay, so that's what I mean. So guilt is not just a feeling of pain or pained by having done something. It's a self-addressed demand and it's part of holding oneself responsible for that. Now, you've asked pretty fine-grained questions about under what circumstances is blame intelligible on certain assumptions about what the person did know, what they should have known, what they're capable of knowing, and so on. And all I need to defend for purposes today, I think, is that there are some requirements in that general area that blame has that just don't go with contempt at all, and that guilt. So even if I think you did something, or you thought I did something, right? So even if you think I did something which is blameworthy, lacking excuse, well, you might take the fact of the difficulties of my epistemic situation as excusing me. If you come to the conclusion that I just can't possibly get the moral at all, right, moral demands at all, well, then it's off the table, and it is incoherent for you to hold me accountable in that way. And so you've got to relate to me in some other way. You've got to protect yourself, quarantine me, do something else. That's the thought.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So that's fascinating. I found myself wondering whether Williams would have considered your view a species of ethics, and not to disagree about words, but Paul sort of was observing in some ways you're sort of on the same page in some broad respects. I mean, lots of differences between your views, absolutely, but of course, there's a way of you're sort of showing that there can be moral theories which are not part of the morality system, but in another way, he's saying, well, if your theory isn't embracing these egregious aspects of the morality system, then great, we're on board together. But the key point I think of as prompting Williams's shift from talking about morality to talking about ethics is his utter rejection of there being a special category of obligations or reasons that are moral obligations or reasons, and they behave differently from other sorts of obligations and reasons. And it sort of looked like, I know you didn't address this in quite the same terms, but in your talking about his critique in 13, that Williams' claims of overreach concerned all things considered obligations, not pro tanto obligations. I think one way of putting his view is that, I think that moral obligations are sort of pro tanto in the sense that they're like other, there are ethical considerations. There's just shoulds, not special kinds of oughts, he always used to say. Yeah. So I wondered if, given that you seem to be on the same page in that conception of obligation and there not being a special category, plus he's keen on the idea that we can generate requirements and commands, indeed practical necessities, out of broadly interpersonal concerns, and he's no enemy of reactive attitudes, even though he didn't put things in those terms. He's talking about, emotional responses, kind of broadly Humean background. So there's a great deal in common, and I just wondered, though you have every reason to call your view a view of morality, and there's no fight about terms, I just wonder if he would have regarded your view as importantly a theory in ethics of a kind he can agree with you, who's making none of the mistakes or engaged in none of the fantasies he regarded the morality system as engaged in.
Well, two thoughts about that. One is, you're saying, well, he agrees that obligations can be created in interpersonal ways in all kinds of different ways, let's say. Right. So I think the crucial issue here is whether the obligations are inherently normative or not. Now, normative in what sense, right? So, Parfit makes this distinction between normative in the rule-involving sense and normative in the reason-involving sense. Now, I take it that moral obligation is normative not just in the rule-involving sense, but in the reason-involving sense. Now, so there are all kinds of, as it were, conventionally defined obligations, legal obligations, for example, which are not inherently, they're not normative in the reason-involving sense. So, for positivists, let's say, about the law, then there'll be a fact about what my legal obligation is with respect to the tax law, and what am I legally obligated to do, what I'm not legally obligated to do. And that, as a conceptual matter, leaves it open. I could just say, and this is on positivism, maybe you reject positivism, but if we accept positivism, then the thought is it's consistent with that I have no reason necessarily at all to do what I'm legally obligated to do. So for me, the real issue is between genuine, as it were, de jure normative obligations and anything that could be socially constructed simply through people's attitudes and public behavior. And so I don't really care what we call these things, But what I'm trying to defend is the existence of the normative, of genuine deontic normativity, which is, it's this curious thing that on the one hand, well, it's to be understood in terms of normative reasons, but not normative reasons for action, normative reasons for the holding accountable attitudes that are conceptually connected to the deontic concepts of right, wrong, and so on. That's one thought. The other thought I had, oh yes, the other thought I had was, suppose Williams says, as you were saying, that we accept these pro tanto obligations as just, you know, these are ethical considerations. And so we can ask, so I've got this pro tanto obligation created by my promise, I got a pro tanto obligation to help somebody else, let's say, and then we just ask, well, really, what should I do? And the should is not itself deontic, it's this ethical should. I hold a brief that we need this further notion of what we're all things considered morally obligated to do, otherwise we don't get culpability. You're not culpable for violating just insofar as you violate any pro tanto obligation. And you're not culpable just insofar as you do something you had failed to have the best reasons for doing. To get culpability onto the table, we've got to have the idea of your all things considered moral obligations. I think that's where the real issue is going to end up being. Yeah.
I think we have time maybe for just one more question, though there is more than one hand up, but people can perhaps carry on the conversation afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. I was wondering about 8, where you drew the distinction between, so two people can agree that there's most moral reason to do something, but disagree whether acting on those reasons is morally obligatory. And there you say what they disagree about is whether not acting on those reasons would be culpable. And there I was wondering sort of, what's the direction of explanation here? Do you think that being culpable is something that is, in a sense, conceptually or epistemically prior to understanding that something is morally obligatory? Or is it sort of, how do I establish this culpability? Yeah. And then I have a tiny footnote question on that. You have, after all, the notion of pro tanto obligation. How do you explain that, since culpability surely doesn't play a role there?
Since culpability, oh, yeah, okay, good. Sorry, I missed the first question. First question was?
It was sort of, do you think we
Sorry.
Is the idea kind of a Straussonian one, basically, that have...
Yes. Which is the independent variable, which is the dependent variable.
Right.
Yeah, so for purposes of this argument here, I just say it's a conceptual equivalence claim, necessary conceptual equivalence claim. What do I really believe? Well, I actually do tend to think that it's reasons to blame. That's the independent variable, and we have no independent purchase on the idea of obligation except in terms of what there is reason to blame. And I don't defend that idea, but it seems to me an attractive idea. It's a way of being a reasons firster, okay? And I do tend to think that all normative notions have to be, at least normative notions that are normative in the reason-involving sense, have to be understood in terms of reasons for attitudes of some distinctive kind, and the attitudes that are distinctively involved in obligation are precisely the holding accountable attitudes. So now I've forgotten the second question. The second question was about...
How do you explain pro tanto?
Oh, pro tanto, thank you, yes. Well, so a quick and dirty way to try to do it that doesn't work is what would be your obligation, other things being equal. So you have to say something stronger, like which tends to make something an obligation. And that tendency can either be overridden by some other thing that, so it tends to make something your obligation, all things considered. That's the idea. And there are cases where that tendency remains and it's overridden by something else. And there are other cases where the tendency remains, and it's nonetheless, it defeats the claim that you're obligated. There's no other tendency to make something an obligation. There's just a tendency to defeat the, I mean, there's still the tendency to make it, like in the promise case, let's say, you promise, but in this case, in the CAM case, for example, the opportunity to do great good defeats this is the things actually being an obligation, all things considered. And then there are other cases where, like, I promise you to do something, and then it turns out, though I promised you to do it, you don't want me to do it after a while, and you actually want me not to do it, and now the fact that I promised doesn't even have any tendency to make it my obligation. But yeah, I would tend to understand it, I would understand it in terms of tendencies to make something an obligation, all things considered. And here again, so going back to Miranda's question, so I think we need this notion of what your obligation, all things considered, to get the right purchase on even the idea of pro tanto obligation. What is so going back to that discussion again, what would it be for something to be a pro tanto obligation that wasn't simply just one kind of ethical consideration among others? And my thought is, well, it's tendency to make something our moral obligation, all things considered. Want to keep the notion. Yeah.
Stephen, thank you very much indeed. That was fascinating and a great discussion.